Welcome back to another episode of the I Try to Be Straight podcast with Susie
and Nate
and Ethan in the back.
And Ethan in the back. Oh, yeah, we're name dropping now because
we did drop his name.
We dropped his name
on the Insta.
On the Insta. And we are at my apartment, which we don't usually go to because I got this apartment in a hurry and I did not realize there were these creakers above. This apartment is old and it's in Midtown Sacramento, which is awesome. Vintage. The location is great. But every so often, whenever they walk across, the creaking is insanely loud and we wake up to it often. And that's just the charm of an old building. But this is my house. Welcome to my abode. It's not as cute as Susie's. I'm sorry. We were just
recently told these look like Colorado, which is a great segue
into our guest. Because, I'm doing the whole intro now. We have Julia Sadusky, who is a therapist who talks about how growing up in the religious community and dealing with your sexuality can affect you. And we really want to dig into more of these conversations with some people that know a lot. And Julia is one of those people. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hi, guys. It's so good to be with you.
Good to have you. So I know we talked about maybe digging into shame and the different things that can take a toll on us as we go through this process. But I really want to know just a quick intro, why you're doing what you're doing and how you got started.
Yeah, so that goes all the way back to being a teenager. And, I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up Catholic and went to Catholic school and, learned a lot about sexuality from kind of a Christian perspective and at that time. And then I started to have people in my life come out to me as gay, or at that time they might have used words like same-sex attracted. And it really impacted me, honestly, as a teenager and then a young adult. Just learning about experiences where people were asking questions like, am I going to hell by virtue of my attractions? Do my attractions have to change for me to be a Christian? What does a life look like for me long term as a Christian with same-sex attraction? And so I think the way I often think about it is that I kind of made their questions my own at that time. So as a straight person, I just really wanted to understand more about what does God have for gay people in the church? And that really started my journey in reading about theology and reading about psychology, and became a psychologist and studied under Mark Yarhouse at Regent. And that was really where I started doing a lot of research in this space. So walking with conventionally religious people and families at the intersection of faith and sexuality. But yeah, that's a little bit about how I got into it.
Wow. So what stuck out to you about the experience of gay people in the church? What were the things that you saw that didn't feel quite right?
Yeah. So the first thing that struck me was, people in my life, it was kind of the time of Exodus when I was coming, into college. And so I had people who were maybe having kind of conversions back to Christianity through Protestant evangelical circles, and parents were sending their kids to Exodus retreats or conferences. And so I was hearing from people in my life about this kind of narrative of sexual orientation change, almost as if it was a light switch that goes on and off for people. Yeah. And I just remember at the time, really it not sitting right with me that you would be expected to no longer experience an attraction pattern to follow Jesus. And so I remember wrestling with that with people in my life who were really convinced by that at the time. And then I kind of witnessed their journeys from there, where for many of them, that approach ended up being really harmful. And that would be one of the first things that didn't sit right with me as I started to learn more about it.
So in this process, you're experiencing you're digging into psychology, and also you're coming from a religious culture where obviously we all know what it's like. There's not a lot of answers if you're gay. It's kind of very cloudy. It's just confusing. And so were you trying to struggle to reconcile, well, this is what the church is saying and this is what psychology is saying? How did you figure out how to mesh those two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think how it started for me was I was at my Catholic college and I was studying theology of the body at the time. And so it was almost as if I was reading that for people in my life who were gay and saying, is this too costly or demanding for them? Like, is there a path for thriving in a traditional sexual ethic for people experiencing same-sex sexuality? And as I read that, I didn't see anything in any of those reflections or even scripture as I looked there that seemed to overtly contradict science. So then I think what I became really aware of was a lot of the ways Christians talk about homosexuality do contradict science, but actually there's not a teaching that they're always drawing from when they do that. So I think at that time, I didn't feel so much like faith and science were in conflict, but I did feel as if the way our communities talk and engage with LGBT people very often is in conflict with the science. So a good example would be those narratives of change. I wasn't seeing when I studied the research on conversion therapy or the research on efforts to change attraction, that was very promising for people and happening for most people. And then as I sat with clients who had pursued change for, almost a decade in some cases, I was witnessing them report ongoing experiences of same-sex attraction, even if they had experienced fluidity in that or opposite sex attraction at some point. And so some of those narratives I really began to challenge. And then the other piece of it would be the theories of causation that your listeners know probably better than most, which is these ideas, right, of environmental theories for same-sex sexuality and bisexuality. And so I really pushed back on those in Christian circles from the vantage point of the science, that the science wasn't conclusively showing any one causal path for people. And I actually didn't think that mattered that much as far as what it means for how people, live and move and thrive in the world, how they came to experience what they do. So I tend to be a bit agnostic about all of that. And I think in a lot of Christian circles, it's been very much assumed that if you're a faithful Christian, you believe these environmental theories. And that never resonated for me as well.
How do you engage with someone who you might be having this conversation with them and you kind of bring up the science portion of it and they're like, well, I'm not a scientist, but like, I know the word of God says, da, 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 da. Like, how do you even start to engage with someone that thinks that way?
Yeah, I think the way I think about it is probably a bit related to my formation in psychology. So one of the forms of therapy I really like is called narrative therapy, and it looks at the dominant stories we've been kind of given about something. And so even when I see it differently than somebody, and this happens a lot, especially with Christian parents who will say, but the word of God says, God made us male and female, for instance, and that means something about sexual expression to them, but it also means something about even sexual attraction, I think, in some cases, where it's as if by virtue of experiencing same-sex attraction, you're kind of willfully disobeying God. And so I always like to know where they heard that, because if I come in as a psychologist and say, well, here's the science, but they've had every pastor who's mattered to them, who's shown up when their mom passed away and has really supported them in their life, said something completely different, I'm just one more source of authority that they're not going to agree with. And so I like to ask, who told you that that scriptural passage is translated into these attractions are volitional, or these attractions are something a person is committing a sin by virtue of experiencing. So I just like to know where they're coming from. And it also takes away the defensive posture where I don't feel threatened by that. I don't need to kind of convince them as much as I would want, if I were them, I would want to know the lay of the land a little bit more. And that's really how I frame it is, like I've wrestled with scripture, I've read that, and I think scripture is a reliable guide for us in our lives. And I have never sat across from somebody with same-sex attraction who woke up one day and said, I'd really like to experience this. And so this idea of willful disobedience, I'm just not hearing volition there. I'm not seeing volition. And so just being honest with them about that. And then I would also say that, a lot of people are holding on to a kind of hope of change and for themselves or for a loved one. And so kind of honoring those hopes, like I'm not here to dash that. I'm not here to tell you can't hold on to hope for a different outcome for yourself. And I do want to be honest with you about what we know and what we don't know from psychology insofar as that's helpful. So it's pretty non-combative and just holding it out. And I think for many people, they're relieved by that because they don't feel like we're entering into some type of gridlock. And yet it gives them an opportunity to receive a different perspective.
So it sounds like from your journey, you just held science and religion both, and just had a pretty open mindset, pretty open to learn, open to hear, just wanted to learn from people. And you didn't really have a super strong bias on either side. You were just learning. And this is kind of where you came to, that people aren't really changing. And I guess there's just an openness, it seems, that you carry. Is that kind of where you ended up, of we don't know everything?
Yeah, I think especially in the questions that felt like taken for granted realities in the common Christian lexicon, things like orientation, causation, and change felt to me like areas that I could be agnostic in a way, and kind of hold with an open hand. And so I've kind of operated in that. I would say early on in this work, I would have felt maybe a bit more threatened by perspectives that would have challenged or invited me to really reflect on deeply held convictions I had about sexual ethics. And so I think what's shifted for me in that is I don't feel threatened in the same way as I used to. It's been an anchor for me to recognize that different beliefs are not so fragile. That kind of wrestling with, if they're fragile, that means they're probably not true. And so being able to really enter into deep excavation almost of these things with people, and walk with people who kind of make different decisions and come to different conclusions. I wouldn't say it's made me like relativistic in that sense, or it doesn't matter. I believe all these things matter a great deal. And yet I do feel an openness and a flexibility in me to receive people where they are without feeling enormous pressure to kind of make them be somewhere else, I suppose. And so I'm grateful for that, because that does make this work a bit easier than I think it otherwise would be.
In terms of meeting people where they're at, a lot of people come into this, or not even come, they find themselves trying to change, then they find that they can't change. So then the next step, I guess, in the Christian space would be to maybe live a life of celibacy. And we were talking about your dissertation. Curious if we could get into that. Yeah.
So I did my dissertation on loneliness in single sexual minorities. So people attracted to the same sex who feel conviction to live a life of singleness permanently, and how they're coping with loneliness over time. So at the time that I did that dissertation, I really felt like in the secular field of psychology, it was as if people who committed to singleness were simply repressed, and it was kind of only a matter of time. So think in terms of the change narrative, it was kind of one more way that people were repressed, and it was not sustainable. And then at the exact same time, I heard in our faith communities that was becoming kind of the solution in the absence of change. So if you're not going to experience change, then the default is singleness. And I remember sitting across from a teenager who literally said to me, "I can't be a Christian anymore." And I said, "Tell me about that," And she said, "If I'm Christian, then I have to be single. And if I'm single for the rest of my life, it'll be a death sentence."
Wow.
And that told me something, right, about the conflict for people, where they're feeling like either I pick my faith and I'm signing up for this death sentence of loneliness and celibacy, or I walk away from my belief system and my community and my church family, and I have to leave all of that behind in order to not be miserable. And so I got really curious about, number one, why do people pursue celibacy? Like what's happening for them? What are the reasons they would give as far as what draws them to that? How much of it is external motivators versus internal motivation? And then what's their experience of loneliness? Do they attribute it to the celibacy, or are they attributing it to something else? And then just asking people a little bit about how they experience loneliness and how they cope with it. What are the things that are really helpful? What are the things that are not as helpful or really push them around? Because I figured there were people out there with wisdom in this, and I wanted to hear from them. And to be honest with you both, the idea for it came from meeting with some Catholic nuns who were talking about loneliness and singleness. Yeah. And I thought, gosh, I'm hearing from them how they're managing that. Wouldn't it be great to hear from gay Christians as well? So that's the idea behind that research.
It's really interesting because you figure in Catholicism, this is happening a decent bit, like with nuns and priests. But these are all people that are choosing this because they feel deeply convicted. Whereas when you're a gay Christian, it's just like, well, you're just going to have to do this. And we didn't want, I feel like the kind of people that sign up to be nuns are people that know what they're getting into. You know, these are very special people that deserve a lot of respect. And I also think they get so much support, because when you have a community of nuns and the church is like praising you and blessing you,
Right.
whereas when you're a gay Christian, if you talk weird or look weird, even if you do celibacy, often you're still kind of ostracized. So that's a really interesting comparison. I don't know if that's really a question, but have you seen the difference? I guess here's the question. I always just like turn some weird rambling and then I find the question at the end. It's so true. That's what the
You
word.
always
I
find
find
it.
the question. I bring it back. I guess the question here that I just made up is, how would you compare that celibacy in the Catholic Church when you're choosing it versus this forced celibacy when you're just gay?
Yes, it's such a good question. So when I was doing my lit review for this dissertation, right, a lot of the research in psychology is on Catholic priests, actually, and how they cope with celibacy. So not a lot of other people are doing this, as you can imagine. So
I wonder why.
Yeah. And actually that line of research was not exactly, I guess you could say, optimistic as far as all of the ways in which that plays out for people. So the research was done on a very specific cohort of Catholic priests. And so to be balanced about it, you know, is that reflective of all Catholic priests? Probably not. It was the 70s, 80s, 90s experience in predominantly Western American priests. But that research was showing some challenges for priests. And so a lot of the research on celibacy was coming out of that. And you're right to point out that at least in the Catholic context, there's a bit of a framework for this that's positive versus what I was learning in Protestant context, which was if a person is pursuing, let's say, being a pastor and they're single, they're actually seen with more suspicion. And often it would be the case that a church would hire a married pastor over a single pastor. Out of suspicion and doubt of their capacity to kind of manage their passions in a virtuous way. And so as I learned about that, I thought, wow, okay, so in Protestant context, there's not even a kind of positive vision for this in general, let alone when you're experiencing same-sex sexuality. And so that was striking. And then I actually, you know, my line of research was 14 participants, not a big study, qualitative interviews of about an hour and a half with people. And I tried to find half of my sample to be Protestant and half to be Catholic for this reason, because I thought, what is the difference between how people are navigating this as Protestants versus as Catholics? And that theme came out, which was there are the kind of structures in our communities of Catholicism for the consecrated life for priests, and that's really revered. But what about for people who don't become priests and don't enter into a consecrated life? Well, they don't get the same access to community that is kind of built into those vocations. And then certainly in Protestant circles, there really isn't a structure for this. There's not a framework, and people are seen with a lot of suspicion. And so as I asked people about what drew them to celibacy, you know, often they reminded me I didn't feel drawn to it as much as it felt like it was what was expected of me. So you mentioned that for some people, it was an expectation from other people that was really placed on them that maybe they stepped into, but they didn't feel like they even chose it. And then there were people who said, you know, I did feel like I stepped into this volitionally. Like there were things about the way I was living my life, the things that God was placing on my heart that made singleness feel like the path for me to be able to really glorify him in some of these particularities of how I wanted to live and serve him. And so whether that was in ministry or whether that was in showing up to the families in their life and being able to travel to visit and support other people and be supported by them, there were people who felt like they had a say in the matter and they opted into this. And actually, when I would ask those people about, you know, their experience of loneliness, they would actually say, I don't attribute the loneliness to the celibacy. It's not the absence of sex that's making me lonely. It's the absence of these structures that are built into community that I can step into and find access points to people who are walking with me. So somebody gave the example of, what do I do when I'm 50 and my back's really hurting and I have to get a new fridge and I need to move out out the old fridge and get the new fridge. Like who do I call and who's going to be aware of that challenge for me? Or I'm sick in the hospital and I'm sent home and I, need to take meds at these times. Who's going to be checking in to make sure I'm doing that? It was those types of structures that aren't exactly mapped in a Western context, especially I think in many of the evangelical circles that many people find themselves in.
I think it's really interesting there. That's always kind of the thing that I came to at the end of my journey when I was trying to be straight is, okay, so conversion doesn't work. The Exodus movement, conversion therapy, very recent case of them trying, failing. And then the other option is kind of celibacy. And the church doesn't really support people that are doing celibacy very well. It's very rare that someone that's trying the celibate journey is actually very supported by their church. A lot of people are just uncomfortable, especially in churches that are even less progressive. And so if you're getting Christian and you're trying to do everything right, it's still, even if you're trying to do the Christian recommended way, there's just no real easy, simple, or happy path. I mean, there's variances here and there, but in general, I'm speaking, it's a pretty sad life as a gay Christian if you're following what the church is telling you to do. That's what I noticed. I'm like, I just don't believe this is the way we're supposed to live. I don't believe whatever reason we're gay. Like, I don't believe sadness, shame, and drama should be the path that we are given and the only path.
Yeah. What's interesting is I guess in my experience, the churches I've been to really glorify marriage and they glorify relationships. And so when you're a single person in those spaces, you're always being asked, well, what's your type? Who are you into?
Yeah.
Is there anyone I can hook you up with?
Why aren't you married?
Yeah.
Why aren't you married?
And
oh, you're so pretty. Why aren't you married?
We should set you up with that person. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And literally the only commonality is your age. And you're like, okay.
Yes. You have one thing in common. What could you need?
I watched him sniff his farts and you want me to marry him. He's like, Susie won't marry me.
Yeah, no, literally. Okay. And then on top of that, we live in this culture and society where the thing that is also glorified is relationships and romance and all these things. And so being celibate is really quite an alternative lifestyle. And I do think there are people who are doing it and they're doing it well. So I don't want to blanket statement that it's sad for everyone, but a majority, maybe there is a missing piece there for them. And I don't know. I mean, your study would tell us more than I could, but we do also meet people who realized that they were gay or experiencing same-sex attraction and they decided to marry somebody of the opposite sex. Do you have any research or any thoughts on that way of lifestyle?
Yeah, so I definitely met with a good amount of people in that situation and have followed the research in there. In psychology, right, we call that mixed orientation marriages or mixed orientation couples, where one person in the couple is kind of primarily attracted to the same sex and the other person pretty exclusively attracted to the opposite sex in most cases. And so that can be challenging for people. And it really was, again, if you think of prescriptive paths, it was kind of another prescription given to people, even people being told that, if you get married to somebody who you feel really compatible with, the attraction will come, that will kind of develop over time. And what we've seen from the research on these types of couples is that, if the disclosure happens before marriage and both people went into the marriage feeling like they knew that this was a variable to attend to and to kind of get support around, then they do really a lot better than the couples for whom that kind of discovery comes after marriage, whether through an infidelity or something like that, or they just find out later. It can feel a bit like a shock for everybody that comes up. And so, definitely couples in these situations, are really trying to figure out how do we stay married if possible in a culture that on the one hand, one narrative would be you're not ever going to be your authentic self until you're with somebody of the same sex, if that's your primary orientation. And so that can lead to a real villainization of the straight person in that relationship where they're kind of a threat to authenticity. And as you can imagine, that doesn't work very well. Or on the other hand, this idea that you can be attracted to the same sex in a heterosexual marriage, but please don't talk about it. Like we don't really know what to do with that in Christian context a lot of the time. So similarly, right, there can be places of loneliness there in marriage for people. And I think the couples that do this really well are couples who are kind of willing to cultivate a very unique experience of a relationship with their person. So you're the person I want to do life with, and we're going to kind of invest in our strengths. We're going to know that there's areas of challenge for us. We're going to normalize some of that. Like every couple has their weaknesses or their challenges or things that don't come as naturally for them. And yet we're going to really invest in a relationship where you're the person I'm choosing to do life with. And we want to make this as rich and meaningful and kind of passionate and intimate as possible for us. And so, some couples doing it really well, some couples really struggling within that. And a lot of that seems to have to do with when they find out that this is a part of their story and who they can resource to walk with them in the nitty gritty of what that's actually like.
My assumption is that maybe it's a person by person basis. But I guess my question is like, is it better to be single and lonely or lonely in a marriage where you don't feel like you can be yourself?
Yeah.
I'm asking you. I don't know.
Yeah.
She's looking at one. We're considering.
We'll just solve that right now. I would say that the interesting thing that I learned from my dissertation that has really struck me about loneliness is that loneliness is a universal experience that we cannot escape if we have a beating heart. So sometimes we try to choose a path in life as if I can do this and I can avoid pain and I can have just a good life. And if we're honest, I think most of us try to make decisions that way. Like, do I want this meal or do I want that meal? Well, this will make me feel better. This I enjoy more. And that's all well and good. But when it comes to human emotions, they are part of the course of life. And certainly there are pathways in life when you don't have structures in place, for instance, to support you on your journey, where loneliness can be really debilitating. And that's what we call a kind of chronic loneliness. So loneliness at its best is a check engine light that tells us I'm needing connection. And the connection is not just other people. It's not, I need more people to talk to. It's, I need to feel known and seen and understood both by myself and then by other people. And so it's not, I need to be in a room full of people. I need to be known and seen and connected to by others and myself. And so if we see loneliness as that, then no matter who you're with, where you are, you will feel lonely in your life, this kind of lack of connection at times. And that in and of itself, again, is not a problem. But when loneliness feels like something persistent, that's my fault. Like I'm causing the loneliness. There's something wrong with me that I'm lonely. I'm flawed or I'm messed up in some way. Or if it feels like there's nothing that can be done to address it. So somebody in their 50s who goes to a very small rural church where everybody's married and they're the only single one and nobody invites them over for dinner for the holidays. That can feel like a really enduring pain, right? Where I'm going to be until I'm gone living in this state of kind of pervasive absence and emptiness. And so that's where it becomes, debilitating and leads to isolation and acting out sexually and all the things that can really push people around in singleness and celibacy. So again, it's not so much where will I be more lonely in discernment of, I would say, vocation, but what does it look like to cultivate structures in my life wherever I'm called by God so that when I feel lonely, I can talk about that. I can normalize that. I can experience deeper connection to myself and others. And actually seeing times when I'm alone, as one of my participants said in the study, as almost a school of solitude. So that was how she saw it, was I need to learn that solitude can teach me things even when I feel lonely, and that the loneliness that's coming up for me is not a sign of a deficit in me. It's actually part of being human. And I don't have to stay there. I don't have to stay in that place of loneliness, no matter what my state in life is. And that's really the hope, I think, for people, whether you're married or single or partnered, is loneliness is something that is part of being human that we can move through safely.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Okay, so with the seen, understood, was it valued?
Yeah,
known.
value, known.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Known. So with people who are maybe in the closet, they're not sure if they should come out, and they don't feel like they have someone to, talk to in that sense. What's the best way for them to kind of get out of that chronic loneliness feeling?
Yeah, this is really important because disclosure, being known, is really key. And sometimes in our current culture, the way we talk about disclosure is you kind of come out on social media and everybody now knows you, and that's supposed to be really life-giving for people. And that's actually a luxury. It's actually a privilege to be able to just blast social media with your story and have that go well. I mean, there's a lot of people for whom that would not be wise and helpful for them. And so it's just, let's just start there, right? Is that that can feel really challenging for people and hopeless, that I could never do that. So I can't have intimacy. I can't be known. And what I learned from the people I interviewed was actually what they need is really pockets of safety. So 2 to 3 people who know this aspect of their story. So let's say in a small group at a church, that when I talk about my loneliness, I can talk about the nuances of that as a single celibate gay person and have people appreciate the layers to that. So they're not saying, oh, you're lonely, why don't I set you up with somebody, to your example earlier, right? That's a way in which I feel known. And so being able to disclose in those pockets of safety can take people really far. And even for people who couldn't be trusted, maybe with a certain aspect of your story, like they're not the person you call when you're spiraling out in shame, if you kind of were being pushed around by, sexual acting out, let's say, but they can be somebody who knows about certain aspects of the loneliness, and that when I'm lonely, I withdraw from people, and I don't want to go out. And so if I cancel plans at the last minute, maybe just check in with me and say, I really wanted to see you. It's okay if you change your mind. I'm here. So learning ways to communicate about what loneliness is like for me and how it shows up, so that your community can be able to pick up on some of those kind of check engine lights that are happening for you. So you're not the only one responsible for learning how to manage and identify the loneliness when it's there. So those are a couple of pieces, I think. And then interestingly, one of the people I met with told me that the single most helpful thing in her coping with loneliness in celibacy as a gay person was actually being able to talk about crushes. So I thought that was so beautiful to learn that for her, just being able to say, oh my gosh, I have a crush on this person, and I'm like imagining our life together, and I'm so drawn to them, and just being able to talk openly about that was one of the single most helpful things for her in sustaining singleness. And I thought, wow, how many times in our communities do we do a good job of that? And that feels like a simple tweak that could be done to really walk with people especially in experiences of singleness. I actually think married couples would benefit from this as well, because for people listening, married couples still will experience attraction to people other than the person they're married to. And so being able to have connection. I know. I shock people all the time with that.
That's crazy. In a perfect world, that happens. That's crazy.
That's right.
I have a crush on you, Nate.
Well,
just
thanks.
kidding. I don't.
Cool. No, join the club. No, just kidding. Wow. I don't mean that. It's interesting because I like getting into this, because I think a lot of times, especially dealing with this, we as LGBTQ have so much going on already, where there's deep wounds of loneliness, and even in our childhood, deep wounds of pain. And when we're processing this, a lot of us are looking for the solution. It's okay, coming out and everything will be better. And it's no, there's still a lot of pieces of this you have to process through, and a lot of pain you have to process through. And coming out, then you learn how to date. And I'm not really with anyone. The acceptance has made me happier, but there's still things that I have to deal with. I still deal with loneliness sometimes. I think self-acceptance has made life easier, but the nice thing about talking to a therapist is, and with my therapist, it's everything's about balance, and there's no perfect often. There's just better ways to do things. And it's just about making sure you're dealing with healthy mindsets and getting the healing you need. And there's not one blanket statement that fits everything. So I love the balance you're bringing to these conversations, because I think that's something I'm always looking for. How do we get people on the track to not just trying to eliminate loneliness, but just do things that put them in a better path, and not just trying to fix everything and get better in a second. I would say, like, I think LGBTQ often we're dealing with a lot growing up, like shame, loneliness, rejection, abandonment. And I think there's all these different things we're fighting through. And so I imagine dealing with this with people as we're growing up, like this person that just needed to talk about this crush she had, and all these people that are going down the path of celibacy or going down the path of giving up their religion. What have you seen are the effects of not feeling accepted growing up and not feeling like you can accept this part of yourself? How have you seen that impact people? Yeah,
it's so challenging because I think a lot of people assume that a cognitive shift in theology is the answer to your point of, like, if I can just date, or if I can just do this, like, then I won't be lonely, then I won't be abandoned, I'll feel better. And of course, life happens, right, on life's terms, kind of wherever we go. And so there's grief to be had in that, right? That, like, we're kind of looking for that silver bullet a lot of the time. That if I've seen this with some people where it's like, I've changed my theology, but the theology of my childhood still goes with me wherever I go. Yeah. And so that's not how shame goes away. That's not how self-acceptance happens. And to your point, people then have to figure out, what does it look like to really look at those places of shame, which most of us don't want to look at, and to really process what that felt like for me, what that was like to be a kid in that environment. And then how am I bringing that voice into the present? How am I still internalizing and responding to myself in moments of pain, like mom did when I was a kid, or like, my pastor did when I first came out. And so I see in a lot of people, and almost as if they're allergic to compassion, allergic to the acceptance of another. Clients of mine who won't look me in the eye as they're sharing about their experiences of same-sex sexuality or bisexuality or whatever it might be. And it's as if they're kind of afraid of the compassion because they feel so undeserving of it. Even if they would say, I accept myself and I value myself, to have somebody look at them with receptivity and kindness, they're really expecting disgust. And so really helping people notice that, number one, like, wow, look at that. There's a lot of concern inside that if I take this in, something bad's going to happen. And I think for a lot of people, again, on the other side of taking in somebody's acceptance and compassion or your own is a lot of grief for the ways somebody else didn't do that. And I think that can be a real challenge for people in growing in self-compassion, certainly self-acceptance, and just greater connection to yourself and your life.
How can we practice receiving and giving more compassion, especially right now in our political climate, everything that's happening in the world? Mm-hmm. It seems like there's a lack of empathy and compassion. Just how do we even expand that muscle?
Yeah, the first thing that, if you actually look at the line of research on self-compassion, which I just think is super fascinating, we actually can break down what self-compassion is. Like, what are we doing? What are we being for one another? What are we saying when we're compassionate towards them or offering that to ourselves? And compassion literally means to suffer with. So any effort to problem solve right away, any effort to kind of reframe it even and kind of put a positive spin on it or promote resilience right away, actually can miss the place of suffering with. And so we don't stay there, but we want to start there. So compassion and self-compassion is about honoring a common humanity. So I did this earlier when I said part of being human is experiencing loneliness. And for most people, that feels like an exhale. Oh, okay, so I'm not alone. There's not something deficient in me. I'm not lonely because I'm weird. I'm not lonely because I'm kind of quirky. I'm lonely because I'm human. And so common humanity, that for many people, the political climate right now is really, really activating, really, really painful, really scary, and really overwhelming. And many people feel powerless. So saying to ourselves, saying to other people, you're in really good company in this, and I'm with you. I hear you. I see you, that this is really hard. And of course it is, validating that. And And then offering empathy, right? Kind of being willing to be moved to the pain of another. So sometimes that looks and feels like tearing up on our own behalf when we look back on that little kid who, first found themselves experiencing a crush to somebody of the same sex and immediately felt confused, immediately felt disgusted with themselves because of things maybe they'd heard. And like sitting with that for a minute and saying, oh my gosh, if I saw that kid sitting across from me, I would tear up and I would want to give that kid a hug, right? That's compassion.
Yeah.
I want to be with you. I want to be close to you. I want to show up for you in this moment. And so those are a couple of pieces of compassion and what it sounds like, what it looks like. But most of us weren't taught this. I mean, most of us, nobody taught us. And so lest people listening are like, I'm really bad at compassion. Welcome. Yeah. I mean, it is really hard to offer this when we haven't received it from somebody else. And so how do we receive it? I wish there was like a button that we could press and now we are receiving it. But if you're anything like most people, again, we will feel physiological fear, shame, disgust, a kind of negative reaction to experiences of compassion. Like, I don't deserve that, or I want to run out of the room when you offer that to me. And so expecting that, knowing that that doesn't mean you can't grow in that. But relationships become a bit of an exposure, honestly, where it's how do I sit in the room with you and let you show up for me in that, even while I feel undeserving, unworthy, or resistant to it in some way.
I feel like you're probably like the best therapist ever.
Yeah, I did.
Because everything
Thank
you're saying, I'm
you.
like,
No
this is,
questions.
you can bill us later, invoice us later for the session.
No, but actually,
It's a Saturday. I'm off, so it's good to talk to you guys. So
This
and
is
that
free
means a lot.
therapy.
Free
Wow.
next Saturday.
Yeah, that's right.
We're gonna keep doing episodes and get all our stuff out. No, but actually, on to a personal note, like me personally, and I think I can probably speak for a lot of people. I'm anxious these last few months. And I think we have some people that are on different sides of the political spectrum. So I've tried not to alienate people, but obviously, like, I feel like this has been an attack on our community and certain members of our community. And I just feel anxious for these people. And I also have people in my life that voted against this, voted against me. And I feel like gay marriage could be on the table. Like there's things that are kind of on the table right now. And I have people in my life that voted against it that still want to be in my life, and not even just family, but friends. And I'm anxious because of all this. It feels like my life has gotten harder because of all this, and I'm trying to do things and live a normal life. I've got a couple jobs and a podcast, and I'm exhausted trying to like have capacity for this, trying to help other people. And I feel just broken for people that are being hurt. And also, like, I've been trying to keep my faith, but this has been a real shot in the gut on my faith journey. I'm like, these people used God to do some things that feel very unempathetic. So right now I'm just overloaded with all of this. And I think a lot of people are, and I know you've probably been talking to a lot of clients that are. What would you say to someone like me that's going through this in a small bit, because we don't have a full hour for therapy?
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, right? Yeah, you are not alone in that. Most people feel that way. And I actually think, I think we take for granted how odd the last 8 years have been in our country. And I don't know that we'll fully appreciate it until like 100 years from now, but a global pandemic is not something that we've navigated. And actually, my grandma shared with me last year that the pandemic was harder, and the political climate at that time and within the last 8 years was harder for her than surviving the Great Depression.
Whoa.
Oh my gosh.
And she is a tough lady. So like when she said that to me, it really hit me how familiar we are with unknowns at this point. Like it's one thing to have a sickness that might last 10 days or 14 days. It's another thing to have this pervasive sense that we don't know what's coming. And that's what I'm hearing a lot in my office right now in the political climate is we don't really know what's happening and we don't know what's going to happen. And there may be people who feel excited about that unknown, and then there's a lot of people who feel terrified in that unknown. And it doesn't actually matter in that case what happens, right? I mean, a lot of people say, oh, well, I had somebody share with me this week that, they said, well, I survived the last election and the one before that. And so I almost feel stupid for feeling as scared as I do. And I said, well, you've never gone through this one. And anxiety is about the unknown potential threat. Fear is the actual threat. So anxiety is almost worse. I would rather be chased by a bear that I could see and know than be walking in the woods in Montana, not knowing if a bear was going to jump out or not. And I think that kind of captures what this has been like for a lot of people. And so validating that, not gaslighting yourself into thinking you should feel better than you do, while also moving to a place of anchor in the present of where are my feet? What can I do today that nobody can take from me? And what are the acts of self-assertion, of confidence, of freedom that I can exhibit in the here and now, that no matter what pops up on my Instagram feed, no matter what I see on the news as I'm working out at the gym or whatever it might be, like that can't take this moment from me. And I think that staying where our feet are in the midst of validating all of the unknown and grieving, the ways that this feels really, really terrifying to many people is a good place to start. And to be honest with you both, I've taken a lot of solace in the last several years, especially from reading the lives of people in Auschwitz, actually, because they also lived through times that were unknown. And I love learning about what does the human person do in response to that, that nobody can take away from them. And there's a lot of really beautiful stories of people who demonstrate, I think, the best of humanity at a time when we don't hear the best of humanity because it's not cool. It's not interesting. But I take a lot of solace even just in this conversation now and talking to both of you and seeing the way you are cultivating a platform that says you're here and we care about you kind of wherever you are on the continuum. Very few platforms are able to do that well. And the fact that you are is something that, again, nobody can take that from you. And it is good work that you're doing.
That means a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for all of that.
It's been hard for us because we're on a journey too. And, you post something online and it kind of feels like cement. But what people don't realize is that people behind the cameras actually continue to live lives and continue to evolve, and fears and anxieties, and our faith has changed a lot. And it's been tough, but conversations like this, I'm like, this is why we do what we do, because I do believe that somebody's going to listen to this and they're going to probably contact you to be their therapist. But then on top of that, you're just such a calm voice and a calm presence in what feels like a really murky and unstable time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, we need this conversation, and I'm sure a lot of other people need it too. So I really appreciate you taking the time and having this with us.
Absolutely. It's so good to talk to you all.
Well, someday we'll be in Colorado. We'll have to come say hi. Where can people find you if they want to find more resources from you or follow you? What's the best way? Yeah.
So the easiest way to follow my work is my website, which is just my first and last name.com, juliasadusky.com. I've recently started a YouTube channel just because it's becoming important to me to make accessible and nearly free resourcing in this space so people don't have to read a whole book to know a little bit more about what I think about all of this. And so that's attached to a Patreon, which is another way to connect to me and my work and just some of the conversations I'm trying to facilitate in this space to elevate conversations about sexuality and faith. So those are some of the ways that people can follow along.
And we will have that all linked in the show notes if you guys are interested.
Yeah, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I think Nate and I both need to do a meditation now. Go on a walk.
I know,
process
honestly.
all this.
No, it's been a season, but we're going to be all right.
Yeah, we will.
I guess we'll see you guys next time on the podcast. Discord, Patreon, and all that for us as well. But yeah, have a good one.